February 1945. The frozen earth of Nazi Germany cracked under the weight of history. While George Patton's tanks raced through headlines, another battle raged in darkness, mud, and blood. A battle they said couldn't be won. A battle where Canadian and British forces would prove that slow and steady doesn't just win races, it crushes empires. This is the story of Operation Veritable. And it starts with a laugh. Patton was the rockstar general. Aggressive, loud, fast. The newspapers loved him. When he saw Montgomery planning to push through the Reichswald Forest toward the Rhine, Patton smirked. When he heard that Guy Simonds, the brilliant but methodical Canadian Corps commander, would be leading much of the assault, Patton reportedly scoffed at the cautious, deliberate approach. Too slow, he thought. Too careful. Where was the thunder? Where was the glory? But glory isn't measured in speed. It's measured in results. And what Simonds and his forces were about to achieve would shake the foundations of the Third Reich. Let me take you back. December 1944. The Allies had been steamrolling across Europe since D-Day. Paris was free. Belgium was liberated. The end seemed near. But Hitler had other plans. The Battle of the Bulge exploded through the Ardennes, catching the Allies completely off guard. German panzers tore through American lines. Suddenly, the unstoppable Allied advance ground to a halt. Montgomery's forces were supposed to strike in January. Operation Veritable was ready to go. But the Bulge changed everything. Troops were diverted. The attack was postponed. And then came the worst possible news, the winter thaw. Montgomery had been counting on frozen ground. Tanks need solid earth. Artillery needs stable footing. But as February arrived, the frost vanished. Rain fell. The earth turned to soup. The Reichswald Forest, already dense and forbidding, became a nightmare landscape of mud, mines, and German defenders who knew every inch of the terrain. The Germans were waiting. General Alfred Schlemm commanded the German 1st Parachute Army. His superiors thought the Allies would attack from Venlo, farther south. But Schlemm knew better. He looked at the map and saw what Montgomery saw. The narrow corridor between the Maas and Rhine rivers was the only way into Germany without crossing a major river. So while his bosses positioned reserves elsewhere, Schlemm quietly moved crack paratrooper divisions into the Reichswald. He reinforced the Siegfried Line. He turned every village into a fortress. The Germans weren't just defending. They were dug in like ticks. Concrete pillboxes. Tank traps. Anti-tank ditches. Machine gun nests every 50 meters. Mines, thousands upon thousands of mines. And behind it all, hardened veterans who had survived 5 years of war and knew they were fighting for their homeland now. But Montgomery and Crerar had a weapon. The greatest concentration of firepower ever assembled on the Western Front. Picture this. The night of February 7, 1945. Over 750 RAF heavy bombers thundered overhead, their bellies full of high explosives. They obliterated Cleve and Gotch, 2 key German cities, turning them into moonscapes. Civilians huddled in cellars as their world exploded above them. The bombing was so intense that the ground shook for miles. Then came the artillery. At 5:30 in the morning, February 8, 1,034 guns opened fire simultaneously. Let me say that again. 1,034 guns. The sound was apocalyptic. Soldiers standing near the batteries were literally deafened. Their ears bled. They couldn't hear for hours afterward. The ground vibrated so violently that men couldn't stand. One officer described it as standing inside God's own thunderstorm. This wasn't just artillery. This was Armageddon delivered in steel and fire. Field guns. Medium guns. Heavy guns. Super heavy guns. A third of those guns were massive pieces that could hurl shells weighing as much as a man across miles of German-held territory. 7 full divisional artillery groups. 5 Army Groups Royal Artillery. 2 anti-aircraft brigades turned into ground bombardment units. And among them, gleaming in the pre-dawn darkness, were the Sextons. The Sexton self-propelled gun was Canada's engineering masterpiece. Built on a modified Sherman tank chassis in Montreal, it married the mobility of armor with the devastating punch of the British 25-pounder gun. While other armies struggled with towed artillery that got stuck in mud, the Sexton rolled forward, keeping pace with advancing infantry. Its crew of 6 could rain down shells on German positions, then relocate before counter-battery fire arrived. These weren't delicate weapons. They were workhorses. Each Sexton carried 112 rounds of ammunition. High explosive shells that could flatten buildings. Smoke shells to blind the enemy. And when German infantry got too close, the crew had Bren machine guns to drive them back. In the opening barrage, Sextons and their artillery companions fired over 9 tons of shells onto each of 268 individual targets. 9 tons per target. In a matter of hours. Imagine being a German soldier in that moment. You're in your bunker, maybe 20 years old, maybe 40. You've survived Russia. You've survived Normandy. You think you've seen everything war can throw at you. And then the world ends. The shells start falling. Not a few. Thousands. The bunker shakes. Dirt rains from the ceiling. The noise isn't just loud, it erases thought. You can't think. You can't hear your own screams. Your nose bleeds from the concussion. Outside, the forest is being systematically erased. Trees older than your grandfather explode into splinters. Your comrades disappear in clouds of fire and metal. This went on for hours. By 10:30, when the 1st Allied infantry climbed out of their positions and began to advance, the German 84th Infantry Division facing them had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Those who survived the bombardment were so shell-shocked they couldn't fight. They stumbled around in circles. Some wept. Others simply sat down and stared at nothing. But here's where the legend of Operation Veritable really begins. Because the barrage was just the opening act. 5 divisions attacked in line. 50,000 men with 500 tanks. From north to south, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, the 15th Scottish Division in the center, and the 53rd Welsh and 51st Highland Divisions on the right. They advanced into a landscape that belonged in Hell's art gallery. The mud was the first enemy. Not just mud, a living, sucking morass that swallowed tanks whole. Vehicles that weighed 30 tons sank up to their turrets. The carefully planned tank assault became an infantry slog within hours. Soldiers waded through knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep muck. Every step was exhausting. Equipment doubled in weight from accumulated mud. And then there were the mines. The Germans had seeded every inch of ground with anti-personnel mines, anti-tank mines, mines rigged to other mines. Engineers inched forward with metal detectors, but in many areas the mines were so dense they simply had to be walked through. You heard the click, felt the explosion, and your war was over. Or worse, you heard the click from the man beside you. The weather conspired against them. Rain, sleet, snow. Sometimes all 3 in a single day. It was the worst winter in living memory. Visibility dropped to meters. Men couldn't tell friend from enemy until they were almost face to face. The cold was so intense that weapons froze. Oil congealed in engines. Tanks had to be run every half hour or they wouldn't start at all. But the mud. God, the mud was everywhere. It wasn't just on the ground, it was in your food, your water, your lungs. You tasted it with every breath. Your uniform weighed an extra 20 pounds from absorbed moisture and dirt. Trench foot claimed thousands. Frostbite took fingers and toes by the dozens. And through it all, the Germans fought like demons. Schlemm's paratroopers were among the best soldiers in the Wehrmacht. They didn't break. They didn't run. When their positions were overrun, they counterattacked. When surrounded, they fought to the last man. They turned every farmhouse into a fortress. Every village became Stalingrad in miniature. The Allies discovered something terrible. The German defenders were willing to die in place rather than retreat. SS units and hardened paratroopers would hold a position until Allied artillery literally buried them. Then, somehow, survivors would emerge from the rubble and keep fighting. But this is where Guy Simonds proved his genius. While Patton would have charged headlong into the meat grinder, Simonds fought smart. He used artillery like a scalpel. Forward observers moved with the infantry, calling down fire missions on German strongpoints. The Sextons and their artillery companions pounded positions until resistance crumbled, then the infantry moved in to clear the ruins. Simonds pioneered combined arms warfare in conditions that would have stopped lesser commanders. He coordinated infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, when the weather allowed, into a seamless killing machine. The Germans couldn't concentrate their forces because any massing of troops invited an artillery storm. The Kangaroo armored personnel carriers were another Simonds innovation. He'd taken obsolete Priest self-propelled guns, stripped out the main armament, and converted them into the world's first true APCs. Troops rode inside, protected from shrapnel and small arms fire, then dismounted directly into combat. It sounds obvious now, but in 1945 it was revolutionary. And through it all, the artillery never stopped. Day after day, night after night, the guns fired. German counterattacks were smashed before they could develop. German reinforcements were interdicted before they reached the front. German supply lines were severed. The Sextons and their companion guns created a rolling wall of steel that preceded every Allied advance. By February 10th, the Germans opened the floodgates. Upstream on the Rohr River, German engineers blew the dam controls. Water came rushing down in a torrent. The Rohr Valley flooded. The American Ninth Army, which was supposed to attack from the south as part of Operation Grenade, the southern pincer, couldn't move. The river was a quarter-mile wide in places and moving too fast to cross. This left the Canadians and British fighting alone. The Germans could concentrate everything they had against Montgomery's forces. What was supposed to be a pincer movement became a single-axis assault against the entire German 1st Parachute Army. Most commanders would have pulled back and waited. But Montgomery and Crerar pushed forward. The Canadian 1st Army swelled to 13 divisions, 3 armored brigades, and enough artillery to flatten a small country. They weren't going to be stopped by water and mud and fanatical resistance. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division attacked through the flooded Rhine Plain in Buffalo amphibious vehicles, tracked amphibious carriers that could carry troops through water up to 5 feet deep. Imagine being in one of those. You're sitting in an open-topped metal box, water sloshing around your ankles, German machine guns hammering the sides, praying you reach solid ground before a shell finds you. They fought through flooded fields where German defenders occupied artificial islands, raised positions that became fortresses surrounded by water. Each one had to be stormed individually. The Canadians learned to use the water to their advantage, approaching under cover of darkness, hitting German positions before they could coordinate a defense. Meanwhile, in the Reichswald Forest, the battle became primordial. Trees so thick you couldn't see 50 feet. Every trunk could hide a sniper. Every shadow could be a German patrol. The forest floor was a maze of fallen logs, shell craters, and German fieldworks. Visibility was so poor that artillery couldn't be used effectively. You were as likely to hit your own troops as the enemy. So it came down to infantry. Bren guns versus Spandaus. Rifles and grenades and cold steel. One officer described it as the kind of fighting our grandfathers would have recognized. Man against man in the mud and blood. The 15th Scottish Division fought for days to take the town of Cleve. Pre-war population, 46,000. Post-bombing population, a few hundred in the rubble. The Scots advanced through ruins so complete that streets couldn't be identified. They cleared the town building by building, room by room, sometimes brick by brick. German paratroopers fought from the cellars even as the buildings above them burned. When Cleve finally fell, the division had suffered thousands of casualties. But they'd broken the German defensive line. Farther south, the 53rd Welsh Division and 51st Highland Division pushed toward Gotch. The town was another fortress. German defenders had turned every building into a bunker. They fought with a desperation born of knowing this was Germany now. This was home. Behind them were their families, their cities, everything they'd fought 5 years to defend. The Highlanders attacked with a fury that matched the German defense. Pipers played in the streets, yes, bagpipes in combat, rallying the troops through withering fire. It sounds insane. Probably was insane. But it worked. The skirl of pipes in the ruins of Gotch became the soundtrack to the German defeat. By February 19th, the British and Canadian forces had pushed through the Reichswald. Simonds brought up his 2nd Canadian Corps. Fresh troops. The 4th Infantry Brigade passed through the exhausted 3rd Division and broke the hinges of the German line. The Germans threw everything they had at them. Paratroopers in gray greatcoats attacked in the dawn rain and mist. They hit the Regina Rifle Regiment in a surprise assault. But the Canadians were ready. They let the Germans close to point-blank range, then opened up with everything they had. Machine guns. Rifles. Mortars. The German assault broke like waves against rocks. And all the while, the artillery continued its deadly work. Coordinated fire missions brought hundreds of guns to bear on single targets. A German company tried to counterattack? 500 guns responded within minutes. The shells arrived in a crescendo that lasted exactly as long as needed, no more, no less. Precision destruction. The Sexton crews became legends. They could set up, fire a full fire mission and displace in under 10 minutes. German counter-battery fire always arrived too late, hitting empty ground where the Sextons had been. The mobility of self-propelled artillery proved its worth 1,000 times over. But let's talk about the cost. War isn't clean. War isn't glorious. Every village taken was bought with blood. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry attacked toward Gotch under a rolling barrage. 470 guns fired ahead of them. Imagine walking behind a wall of exploding shells, trusting that your artillery officers had calculated everything correctly. Trust that the shells would land 50 meters ahead, not on your head. Trust that the enemy would be too stunned to fight when you arrived. They made it. But German paratroopers counterattacked. One lieutenant, John Williamson, accidentally called for artillery on his own position. He meant to ask for mortars, big brothers, but said it wrong. Suddenly shells were raining down on the farmhouse he was defending. It worked. The Germans were annihilated. But Williamson's men thought they were dead for sure. War is chaos. War is terror. War is young men doing impossible things because the alternative is unthinkable. By February 22, the Canadians and British had cleared the Reichswald and taken both Cleve and Gotch. The German 1st Parachute Army was reeling. But they weren't broken. Not yet. Montgomery launched Operation Blockbuster. The second phase. The Canadian 4th Armoured Division and British 11th Armoured Division passed through the exhausted infantry. Now it was time for the armour to break loose. The Reichswald Forest lay ahead. Another dark, dense woodland. Beyond it was Xanten and the Rhine itself. The Germans established the Reichwald Gap, a narrow passage through the forest that they defended with everything they had left. Simonds threw innovation and firepower at the gap. He concentrated 3 infantry and 2 armored divisions. The weight of metal was overwhelming. But the Germans made them pay for every meter. In one engagement, German tanks concealed in the forest ambushed Canadian Shermans. At ranges under 500 meters, it became a point-blank slugging match. Canadian crews knew their Shermans were outgunned by German Panthers and Tigers. But they had numbers. For every Sherman lost, 2 more appeared. The Germans couldn't sustain the exchange rate. Flame tanks, Churchill crocodiles, became psychological weapons. The crocodile could shoot flame over 100 meters. German defenders knew that being caught in a pillbox when a crocodile arrived meant being burned alive or asphyxiated. Many German positions surrendered the moment crocodiles appeared. But the Germans hated flame tanks with a special passion. They considered them inhumane weapons. If you were captured crewing a crocodile, you faced summary execution. British flame tank crews earned an extra 6 pence per day, danger money, because everyone knew the risks. Through it all, the artillery continued. The guns that had started this battle were still firing. Some Sexton crews had been in action for 2 weeks straight. They slept beside their guns. They ate while loading shells. The barrels were so hot you couldn't touch them without gloves. Some guns were on their 3rd or 4th replacement barrel from sheer wear. By March 2, the American 9th Army finally got moving. The flooding receded. Simpson's forces crossed the Rohr and began their drive north. Now the pincer was closing. The Germans were caught between Montgomery's forces in the north and Simpson's Americans in the south. The escape route across the Rhine was narrowing. Every day the Allied noose tightened. German commanders faced an impossible choice. Fight to hold the West Bank and lose everything? Or retreat across the Rhine and abandon tens of thousands of soldiers? They chose to fight. Units were ordered to hold their positions to the last man, giving time for others to escape. On March 3, Canadian and American forces met near Geldern. The pincer closed. Thousands of German soldiers were trapped on the west bank of the Rhine. But here's where the German army showed its true colors. They could have surrendered. The war was clearly lost. But they didn't. They fought to create a corridor for retreat. They held the bridgehead at Wesel, fighting off repeated Allied attacks, while engineers evacuated troops and equipment across the Rhine. The fighting at Wesel was apocalyptic. The town was already devastated by bombing. Allied artillery reduced it further to smoking rubble. German paratroopers held the ruins against overwhelming odds. They fought from cellars, from sewers, from piles of bricks. When one position was overrun, the survivors fell back to the next position and kept fighting. It took a full week to clear Wesel. A week of house-to-house, room-to-room combat. By the time the last German defender crossed the Rhine on March 10, Wesel had ceased to exist as anything but a geographical location. And then they blew the bridges. The last bridge over the Rhine in the sector exploded in a geyser of steel and stone. The Germans had evacuated as many men as they could. Now they retreated into the ruins of their homeland to make a final stand. Let's look at the butcher's bill. Allied casualties, 15,634. That's killed, wounded, and missing. Most were British and Canadian, men from farms in Saskatchewan, from villages in Scotland, from cities across the Commonwealth. Young men who'd volunteered to stop fascism. Who'd fought across Europe for almost a year. Who died within sight of victory. German casualties, 44,239. Let that sink in. 44,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The Canadian First Army alone captured 22,239 prisoners. Intelligence estimated another 22,000 killed or seriously wounded. Add in the losses during Operation Grenade, the American pincer, and German casualties topped 90,000. 90,000. Simonds and Montgomery's forces had destroyed the equivalent of 5 German infantry divisions. They'd broken the back of the 1st Parachute Army. They'd opened the way to the Rhine and the final assault into Germany. And they'd done it through the worst terrain imaginable, in the worst weather possible, against some of the best soldiers the Wehrmacht could field. So let's go back to Patton's laugh. George Patton was a brilliant commander. His drive through France was stunning. His relief of Bastogne during the Bulge was masterful. History remembers him as one of the war's great generals, and he earned that reputation. But Operation Veritable proved something Patton never quite grasped. Speed isn't always the answer. Sometimes the slow, methodical approach crushes enemy formations just as effectively as a lightning thrust. Sometimes artillery and infantry grinding forward through mud and blood is what wins wars. Guy Simonds never got the glory. He wasn't charismatic like Patton. He didn't give inflammatory speeches or slap soldiers or race tanks across open country. He was cold, methodical, and brilliant. And under his command, Canadian and British forces achieved what many thought impossible. They attacked through a fortress forest in conditions that turned vehicles into anchors. They fought through flooded plains where half the battlefield was underwater. They faced elite German paratroopers and SS troops who fought with fanatical determination. And they won. Not quickly. Not cleanly. But decisively. The artillery, those 1,000 guns, those Sexton crews who fired mission after mission until their hands bled, created a symphony of destruction that the Germans simply couldn't withstand. It wasn't glamorous. Artillery never is. But it was effective. Devastatingly, overwhelmingly effective. Every German counterattack was smashed by coordinated fire. Every defensive position was reduced to rubble. Every attempt to reinforce the front was interdicted by shells falling from the sky. The Germans fought magnificently. They died bravely. But they couldn't win against the weight of metal the Allies brought to bear. Eisenhower called it, some of the fiercest fighting of the whole war, a bitter slugging match. Montgomery commended the German defenders for their fanaticism. Both recognized that Operation Veritable was won through sheer determination and firepower, not brilliant maneuver or tactical genius. It was hammer and anvil warfare. The Allies were the hammer. Germany was the anvil. And between them, the German 1st Parachute Army was systematically destroyed. By March 10, 1945, the west bank of the Rhine from Nijmegen to Düsseldorf was in Allied hands. The stage was set for Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine itself. And beyond that, the final drive into the heart of Germany. The 1,000-year Reich had less than 2 months left. But here's what often gets forgotten. Wars aren't won by individuals. They're won by soldiers, scared young men who do their duty despite the terror. They're won by gunners who fire shells until their shoulders are bruised black from the recoil. They're won by infantry who advance through machine gun fire because their sergeant ordered them to. They're won by tank crews who climb into metal coffins and drive toward the enemy. Operation Veritable was won by Canadians from small towns who'd never been to Europe before. By Scots who'd been fighting since 1939. By Welsh miners and Highland crofters and working-class kids from London's East End. By artillery crews who turned the Sexton into an instrument of calculated destruction. They didn't fight for glory. Most of them just wanted to go home. But they fought brilliantly because the man beside them was counting on it. Because the officers who led them, men like Simonds, had planned well and trained them properly. Because the alternative to winning was unthinkable. In the end, that's what Operation Veritable proved. That methodical, well-planned operations backed by overwhelming firepower can achieve just as much as brilliant lightning strikes. That slow doesn't mean weak. That the careful commander who uses his artillery like a surgeon uses a scalpel can achieve results that match any cavalry charge. Patton might have laughed at Simonds' slow corps. But Simonds and his forces had the last laugh. They'd accomplished their mission. They'd destroyed the enemy. They'd opened the gateway to Germany. And they'd done it with Canadian-built Sextons and British determination and the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines but wins wars. So the next time someone tells you war is about speed and dash and glory, remember Operation Veritable. Remember the 1,000 guns firing in concert. Remember the Sexton crews who fired until their guns glowed red. Remember the infantry who slogged through mud and mines and machine gun fire because they had a job to do. Remember that sometimes the slow, steady destruction of enemy forces through artillery and combined arms tactics is exactly what's needed. That wars aren't always won by the fastest army, but by the most determined one. And remember the 90,000 German casualties. The broken divisions. The shattered defensive lines. The bridges blown into the Rhine. all achieved by forces that Patton thought were too slow. History doesn't remember Operation Veritable the way it remembers Patton's race across France. There's no movie about it. No famous general barking quotable lines. Just mud and blood and artillery fire and young men dying far from home. But it was one of the critical battles of World War II. It broke the German defensive line west of the Rhine. It set the stage for the final Allied offensive. And it proved that methodical, firepower-heavy operations could achieve decisive results even in the worst possible conditions. Guy Simonds went on to command the Canadian Army after the war. He never sought glory. Never promoted himself the way Patton did. When people asked about Operation Veritable, he'd say simply that his troops had done their duty and the artillery had done its job. That understated Canadian modesty hid one of the war's most impressive achievements. But the numbers don't lie. 90,000 German casualties. The Rhine secured. The gateway to Germany opened. All achieved by forces that were supposedly too slow. So maybe speed isn't everything. Maybe there's something to be said for the commander who plans carefully, uses his firepower wisely, and grinds the enemy down through relentless pressure. Maybe the tortoise really does beat the hare sometimes. Or maybe, just maybe, having 1,000 guns and the determination to use them is the real secret to winning wars. Operation Veritable ended on March 11, 1945. The guns fell silent. The surviving soldiers caught their first full night's sleep in weeks. And somewhere across the Rhine, what was left of the German army prepared for the final defense of the fatherland. They knew they were beaten. The writing was on the wall. But they'd fight on because that's what soldiers do, even when the cause is lost. The Allies knew they'd won. Not the war, not yet. But this battle. This critical, bloody, hard-fought battle that had cost so much and achieved so much. In 2 months, Hitler would be dead. In 3 months, Germany would surrender. The war in Europe would be over. But on that day in March 1945, as the artillery finally stopped firing and the last German defender crossed the Rhine, all anyone knew was that they'd survived. They'd fought. They'd won. And the Sexton crews cleaned their guns one more time, loaded up their remaining ammunition and prepared for the next battle. Because that's what you do. That's what soldiers have always done. You fight. You survive. You keep going. Until the war is won. Or until it's your turn to fall. That's the story of Operation Veritable. Not a story of glory in headlines and dashing cavalry charges. But a story of determination and firepower and soldiers doing the impossible in conditions that would have broken lesser men. A story of how slow forces crushed 90,000 German troops and opened the road to Berlin. And a reminder that sometimes, the last laugh belongs to the general who planned carefully and used his artillery wisely. Even if George Patton never admitted it.